Good evening, friends. Welcome to this Pendragon Foundation stream. And this is the first of a fortnightly show where we're going to be discussing either something to do with history or something to do with the restoration of castles. And this stream in itself might come as a bit of a surprise what we're going to be talking about today, because we're going to be focusing not so much on historic buildings, but on land, how we should use land, how we should approach it. We're not just thinking about it as something, an economic resource, but something that is beautiful, something with its own history, something which is intimately tied to castles. And if I may, by way of introduction, I want to give you three examples of how castles and land are tied together, because this will help us as we go into the conversation. Let me just bring up these. The first of these. So this is Norris Castle on the Isle of Wight. Norris Castle. It is up for sale at the moment and is an impressive building in itself. It's not particularly old in its current construction, but there's always been a castle in that location for hundreds of years. And as you can see, it's worth £4.5 million in total. But what's interesting here is that it's not just a set of buildings that you're getting. You're getting a lot of land for that. You're getting 225 acres. That's approximately 1 mile of sea frontage. So you're getting a significant portion of land as well as buying a building. Let's look at another example. So this is Shuna Island, right up in the far northwest of Scotland. And you get a castle as part of it. You actually get two. There's this one here, which is needing significant restoration work, and a medieval castle with only the foundations remaining. But you're not just getting a building, you're getting a whole island as part of that. And the island itself is about 1,000 acres or 1,100 acres. So again, you're getting a significant piece of land. A third example, just to kind of complete the set. This is Armadale Castle. It is in the Isle of Skye. And you can see here that there is a lovely castle, again, a 19th century creation with lovely gardens in the back. But if we look at what is available, you can see that there is a lot of land accompanying this castle. And some of these, for example, we've got here 78 acres of woodland. We've got 94 acres of woodland. We have fields as well. So your investment here isn't just in a building, but in the landscape around it. And I think this is quite important because Pendragon, as we've been doing our research, as we've been studying castles and thinking about which places are good to restore, how we can maximize our efforts in bringing new life to these places, we keep coming across the fact that castles are intimately bound up with their landscapes. And this is quite natural. If we think back to what castles were in the medieval era, they were somebody's residence. They were a lord's residence, and he would own grand tracts of land. And the people who worked those lands would come to the castle to pay their rents, to engage with the lord, and so on. So these were really the seat of power which controlled a vast swathe. And so many of these castles still have that connection with those landscapes today. So from Pendragon's point of view, thinking about how we use land, how we think about our efforts of restoration, of making castle centres of community, culture, and commerce, they very much apply to the landscapes around them too. So in this first stream, we're going to be discussing approaches to land and how there's been a history to that and how we should go about that today. Joining me to discuss this topic, I'm delighted to introduce the Black Horse. Black Horse, welcome to the channel. Would you say a little bit about yourself for the listeners out there?
Sure. I've been active in this space for a very long time. You and I have streamed together a number of times.
Mm-hmm.
I've been involved with the Beowulf Foundation on and off for maybe 4 or 5 years now. I run a channel a publication called the Red Ensign that has a YouTube channel, a Substack. I'm quite active on Twitter. From the point of view of a traditionalist and a Christian, and concerned deeply with the history and heritage of the Anglo-Saxon peoples.
Thank you very much. And I think one of the things that you often blend so well together is a real concern for how to put it. There's a sense in which there's a post-political isn't the right word. It's almost like we need to step outside of the kind of rough and tumble of daily politics and think in a long-term civilizational vision of the very things around us which make our home, and the environment is one of those things which you see in that way, I would argue.
Yeah, I think that's right. At least I strive to.
Mm-hmm. And joining us is another figure who a very good friend of mine and a fellow colleague at Pendragon is Sir Burgundy. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm all right. I've been better, recovering from an illness now. But when Mr. Hood asks you to show up on a podcast, you just can't refuse. So I'm a bit more junior than the other two present on the platform, but I would say relatively similar in views, although not quite there on the Christian side of things. So maybe you can win me over today as well, chaps.
Well, it's great to have you, and maybe you could just say a little bit more about your views in terms of land. We'll be getting more into these issues in due course, but maybe not just land, but your broader perspective on things and how you. Because again, I would suggest that you have a view that we need to kind of step beyond the political divides of today and really consider the use of land in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's just moving beyond sort of, plenty of terms for how modern politics are seen, kind of like a circus, right? Sort of just stepping beyond that and realizing what's really important for the revitalization. If we're actually going to make a difference here, what's going to have the biggest impact? And arguably, it's our connection with the land and being a healthy people. And that's got to come from revitalizing our natural world as well, at least to me. And in some sense, of course, there needs to be a balance met there. But to see our people revitalized, yeah, that's got to come from the earth, from the roots, from the mud.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point already broached in the conversation, because when you deal with the preservation and restoration of historical buildings and historical land patterns, there are two impulses that you see, well, at least two impulses that you see, but two that you might find in this corner of the internet. One is, not sure exactly how to terminologically distinguish, but you see a museum piece kind of impulse where the idea is to restore the building to its precise historical condition at a specific historical moment in order to remember the past as it was, right? You see this. I've visited many Civil War monuments in the U.S. One of them is Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay, and Fort Sumter is preserved as it was after it was shelled during the Civil War, because it's there to really commemorate a very specific moment in American history. It's not a living site, it's a museum piece. On the other hand, there's the impulse to make, there's this impulse to restore the art, architecture, and heritage of a people as part of their daily lived experience, so that a site is both alive and part of a people's history, right? So if you look at the Westminster Block in London, it is very much an active part of British life today. Parliament meets there. The King was crowned in Westminster Abbey. It's a living part of British culture, rather than but it also has this continuity going back hundreds of years. And so there's a sense in which it's not, it's a memory of the past, but it's not a museum piece. And these two impulses are at odds with one another fundamentally, right? You can't freeze a moment in time and have a site be part of the living experience of a people. By the same token, you can't expect a site to live and to perfectly remember a specific moment in time.
This actually gets to one of the fundamental beginning points of the conservation movement of historic buildings in Britain. In the 19th century, there was an architect called Gilbert Scott who was commissioned to restore lots of churches and cathedrals in Britain. And he was a big lover of the Gothic architecture. He actually thought that Gothic architecture expressed something of Christian faith, that in a way this was Christian faith in stone. And so the highest forms of Gothic architecture should be restored in Britain to proclaim the faith. And so he would approach a restoration by saying, well, I'm going to focus on restoring the best Gothic elements in this building, and anything which came after that or obscures that, I'm going to get rid of, even though that has was part of the life of that building. So if the Tudors added something or the Baroque period added something, that has to go. William Morris and others like him, such as John Ruskin, fundamentally opposed this approach. They felt that this was, say, trying to strip a building of its history and capture a moment and hold it in that moment, which is in some ways is impossible, or killing the building and its life. But also, Gilbert Scott is not a medieval architect. He's a 19th century architect, and his mindset will never be the same. And so the architecture he produces cannot be the same. And so they set up the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which was to preserve the building as best it could be, and as a consequence, allow it to have that kind of living element to it. So Morris himself would, produce stained glass windows for buildings, which are decidedly 19th century and influenced by the pre-Raphaelites and so on, but they're in keeping with that tradition. So that distinction was already at the very beginnings of historical restoration in England, at least. I think
interesting.
I think there's maybe a useful kind of connection here with land, though, as well, because and I was going to save this for later, but I think it's worth bringing in here, and it is the figure of John Muir in America. He was one of the kind of primary conservationists in 19th century America, and he was quite involved with Yosemite National Park and trying to protect it. There were certain movements to try and take away half of the national park there, and he vigorously opposed that. And initially, he was working with am I right in saying it's Gifford Pinchot or Pinchot?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, so these two were working together, and Pinchot was head of the National Forestry. So he was quite an influential figure in conservation, but they had fundamentally different motivations for this. For Pinchot, it was actually a pragmatic economic argument for conserving forest. You shouldn't be logging everything now and kind of decimating the forest, because you're not going to get a return in 10 years' time, right? Because you'll have no trees to log. If you manage the forest, okay, your short-term gain might be smaller, but you're going to reap a much bigger reward over a longer period. So you don't want to over log it, or you could apply that to anything. You don't want to use the resource up.
Well, you see this in the distinction between the way forestry managed crown land in Canada is managed versus national or provincial park land. So if you look at Vancouver Island, which contains some of the largest old growth forests anywhere in the world, um, both private and national provincial parkland, the philosophy is you do as little as possible to the forest and allow it to have its natural life.
Hmm.
And the consequence is you do things like leave dead wood. You do nothing at all to interfere with the natural life cycle of the old growth forest. Whereas large areas of the island are owned by our crown land that has logging leases on it, and the logging lease land is carefully managed to minimize the risk of forest fire, because forest fire destroys valuable product, and is carefully cut in order to maximize the long-term value of the annuity of wood produced on the land, right? Especially as what's called the logging transition between 1980 and 2000 occurred, where the Canada started to run out of virgin timber, and so it became quite valuable to have large timbers because they couldn't be easily accessed from just virgin woodland. The relative economic value between a 40-foot tree and a 100-foot tree, the calculus changed quite a bit. And so the techniques of forest management evolved to select for different kinds of timber in different locations, just depending on how prices have evolved. So you can see like a pure preservationist strategy versus a kind of land stewardship strategy, both in the context of attempting to manage forested land.
Well, this is a really great illustration of those two camps, because so Pinchot would definitely be the stewardship, or what they would call conservation, whereas John Muir, who to him it's not a natural resource, it's not an economic resource. Sorry, the landscape is a good in its own right that should be enjoyed. In a sense, I guess it's, well, there's two things. One is there's this romantic notion of nature being sublime and a source of beauty, and thus engaging with it, communing with it as a source of well-being. And he definitely believes that, but he goes further and almost sees it as a revelation of the divine. And so being in nature is getting as close as one can to the divine in this life. And so to see it as an economic resource, he would fundamentally oppose that actually, no, you only use as much as you need and don't go further. So there's a kind of sharp distinction there between the conservation and preservation. What are your thoughts, gentlemen, on this distinction?
I kind of question whether it needs to be there in the first place, right? You sort of wonder if perhaps the two can be intertwined, in the sense it's probably quite hard in the practical sense of, in the example of the Canadian forests that you were bringing up there, Black Horse, how you could sort of have the stewardship at the same time of having to bring in this large amount of virgin timber, but you sort of wonder if the overall health of a forest sort of being in the back end of this, and then you can grow the virgin wood forward from that, is sort of perhaps where the two meet, and that's sort of where my stance originates from, of having not trying to freeze something in time, but trying to keep it moving, because I don't think you can ever freeze something in time. I think it's a fruitless endeavor, and it's best to instead embrace the change that you are going to have, try and maintain, what can be seen as valuable for a people, but simultaneously you can't ignore that there's going to always be an economic pressure of some kind, and there needs to be, in a sense, a release valve there. I don't know perhaps how you might differ from that, or...
Yeah, I mean, my view is complex. So on the one hand, both the natural and historical, whether it's a natural landscape, whether it's a historical building, whether it's like in a semi-industrial landscape, like a farming landscape or a managed or a forest managed for timber, the traditions of a people have to live in order to be felt in the same way. In some sense, if you take them away from their real utility, they become something different, right? So in Canada, we have this wonderful tradition of woodcraft. What I mean by that is historically, one of the primary occupations for Canadians was logging, and the log drives would be cut in the deep interior, and then they'd be the logs would be floated down the rivers to the mills on the larger waterways, and you'd have like actual log drivers who had the job of shepherding the logs down the river. That tradition lives on in the lumberjacking games in Canada, right? So it's a big rural event. You see people doing everything from having competitions for who can chop something down the fastest with an axe to like skills competitions for staying on a floating log. But that tradition, because it's divorced from economic utility, is now basically just an athletic competition. It's not a living tradition of something that's felt by a people. Real logging is not done that way anymore. And so these people are just like athletes and showpieces. They're not part of something that's still alive. And so the way that land is managed, the way that historical buildings are managed, that you have to have this kind of careful balance, because in order for the tradition to live, people have to see it as necessary and productive for their real life. But at the same time, the tradition has to remain connected with the past in order to have any value for the people in discovering their kind of link to the eternal and link to the ancient. So if you take up the example of a historical church, in order, it has to live, there has to be a real congregation and real life in the church for the preservation to be valuable. Otherwise, I mean, there's something of beauty that's being preserved, but it's just a memory. It doesn't live any longer. At the same time, you cannot allow the life of that local church to take St. Paul's Cathedral and redecorate. So there's a delicate, or maybe a more germane example, adding a sound system and like introducing American style rock worship music would in some way completely ruin that tradition. And so you've got to have this elegant balance between the demands of the living organism that is in the traditional space, and to live and breathe and genuinely contribute, and the demands to honor its tradition. And it, to me, there's a stewardship job to articulate between the two. And in my view, both the preservationist model, where you preserve a specific moment in time, and the conservationist model, where you view it as a resource to maximize value of, these are these are like extreme ends of what should be a spectrum that you articulate through for a particular tradition.
So I think there's a lot of questions that I have, and one maybe example which I'd be interested in your thoughts, gentlemen, is somewhere like the Lake District or Yosemite National Park might be the equivalent in America. So when we look at the kind of early conservation movement in Britain, one of the kind of initial moments where this really picks up is in the late 19th century, where there's one of these valleys in the Lake District. I'll see if I have the name of it. Yeah, there was a plan to build a railway through this beautiful landscape, because the Lake District is an area rich with slate and slate mines, and there are plenty around that region. So they wanted to build a railway through what is judged to be one of the most beautiful stretches of land in the whole of Britain. And so there was a reverend who lived in that area, Reverend Rawnsley, and he was very vociferous in his campaigning, and he managed to get figures like John Ruskin and William Morris, the Alfred Lord Tennyson, and others to support his cause, and drew on other movements as well to kind of back him. And the public outcry seemed to be so strong, or maybe a better way to put it, the elite, the outcry from a portion of the elite was strong enough to overcome this initial plan. And so that area now is pretty much protected. You can't build a train line through it. You can't build factories or fracking or something like that in that area, because it's judged an area of outstanding natural beauty. So this might be an example of a place which has been designated initially through a group of private citizens banding together, later due to various governmental designations, as an area which cannot be used for economic use because of some notion of beauty, which is kind of interesting that a bureaucratic system that we have today would even recognize a concept like beauty. But for the moment, the question I guess I'm getting at is this: would you consider such a place to be, in some sense, being misused then, if it doesn't have a connection to the daily lives of people, if it's just a place kind of siphoned off to enjoy for its sublime views?
So my view here is that it depends on the relationship between the people and the unaltered natural environment. So I would say that in the Canadian context, the natural and the empty are such an integral part of our culture that their preservation is essential to the maintenance of our culture, right? The minute that you can't be like more than 100 miles away from the nearest person and be sort of backcountry camping, if that situation ever arises in Canada, a part of what Canada has been will have died. And so the existence of the wild and the untamed is an essential part of our culture. Now, the Lakes District has a particular place in British culture that has to be... I don't know enough about it locally to know whether the decision to simply not to leave it completely wild is the correct decision or not, because the Lakes District, like the Canadian North Country, has a place in British culture, right? And it's possible that it could be cultivated better to serve its place in British culture, and it's possible that pure naturalization is the correct way to cultivate it for its place in British culture. And the Lakes District is an example, but this is true of the broader program of rewilding in the UK. The untamed wild is not a very large part of British culture, right? British culture revolves around townlands and the farms surrounding them and the towns at the center of them. And maybe Scottish culture has more element of the encounter with the kind of the wild fringe than sort of English culture does. But the place of wilderness within that cultural context is quite different than the place of wilderness within the context of Canadian culture.
That's interesting that you have that perception, Black Horse, and perhaps it's because of my particular moment in time as sort of the generation that I'm in, or perhaps because of my particular outlook. I'm going to borrow a Welsh word here that I came across a while ago now called hiriaeth. If that I'm pronouncing it correctly, if there's any sort of Welsh people end up watching this, please feel free to correct my pronunciation there. But it's a intense, from what I understand, feeling of loss in a part of a world that you've never been a part of before. It's almost a nostalgia for a place that you've never been to. And particularly for myself and the spiritual connection that I do have with England and sort of the green and blessed land that there is an imagination of England as this sort of wild yet tamed land. You know, you have Sherwood Forest and you have the town. You know, there's the farm that bridges that, or there's a little bit of forestry that bridges that, or the orchards even, and sort of moving that into the Lake District and how that plays in. You know, I feel like there's a certain amount that's attached to the British people in the Lake District that is sort of the embodiment of the green and blessed land. And if you've ever been up there, perhaps you have, Nathan, on holiday at all, there's almost a sense of being at home. It's really strange. I can't quite put it into words, but when you sit into a pub after a day of trekking up one of the mountains or the hills in the Lake District with your family or something, and, you know, perhaps it's not been the best of days and there was a bit of rain coming down on you, but you go into one of the pubs and you hear a couple of different regional accents and it's all nice and cozy, that there's a feeling of belonging there that's somewhat absent from the rest of British life and the day-to-day. And so whilst there is sort of inherent value in, yes, conserving the beauty, and I'm sure the residents and the locals appreciate that, not just being able to look out and sort of marvel at something, and perhaps they don't see a higher being in that, but they can sort of see another worldly beauty. There's also the fact that they can still use that for the agricultural needs that they have in their area. There's tons of sheep farming that still goes on up there. But there's definitely a sense of, you know, spiritual gapping or bridging of a connection that seems lost, at least to me, to the average experience in the British life. And I think that's why tourism is so popular in that area.
I just wanted to come in and echo that experience. Actually, a year or so ago, I was in Coniston, which is just round the corner actually from where John Ruskin's house is. I don't know if you've ever been there, Sir Burgundy, but it's this beautiful tiny village looking up to the up into the hills on the one side and into a lake on the other, Lake Coniston. And I remember being there and having gone on a hike and then returning to the village and just feeling a sense of completeness, but not in a kind of simplistic way of. I think there can be a simplistic contentedness, which is just enjoying the simple pleasures in life, which was part of it. But there was a sense in which even those higher aspirations or higher drives within me were also quite satisfied in that land in a way that I've never quite had anywhere else. And there was a certain vibrancy to everything had a coherency and vibrancy to it. And from the houses, which have the slate from the hill behind it, to the greens and of the colors reflected in the buildings as well. So it was there was a beautiful kind of synergy there to the life and people who lived there. So I guess perhaps kind of pushing back against my own question to a certain degree, perhaps part of what makes the Lake District special is the locality or the people who live there to a certain extent. I think tourism's probably undermined this to a large degree, but the traditional housing and ways of life that are supported by the Lake District are fully integrated into that landscape. And so something like a steam engine coursing through a village or a valley would have totally upset that coherency of of land and people.
I think this is an important point. There's a real sense in which tourism is disruptive to the natural life of a place, of a historical cultural site. Um, Probably the archetypal example of this is you go and visit the Vatican or Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, or I visited relatively recently. I visited um, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, um, and because tourists aren't participating, like they're observing but not participating in the culture and the way of life of the local area, um, they undermine it as a living tradition, and they push it towards being like a dead and sterile tradition. They also provide a means of economic prosperity that is, like, what they do is they transfer resources from some other economically productive enterprise and push it into preservationism, right? So they reduce the need for people who live in that, that traditional lifestyle, to adapt that traditional lifestyle to make it live and breathe in its own right. Now, on the other hand, tourism at its best allows people to experience other parts of their own culture and tradition, and have a periodic experience that they of an organic life that they've been denied by modernity. And so it's this kind of paradox. In some sense, I'm much more offended by foreign tourism than I am by domestic tourism, because foreign tourism, they're coming to observe your culture rather than participate in something that is theirs in some way. I noticed this in Canada extensively, where there's a kind of person who goes to sites of cultural significance for Canada, and it's like, I don't know, they're snapping pictures, and they're having an Instagram experience of the natural beauty of the country, rather than it being an organic part of their life well lived.
I think what you've said is such an important point, Black Horse, and it's almost a little teaser for actually a stream we've got planned on this channel in a month or so. Because I think you're right that there is a part of tourism which often is a search for authenticity, or for a vital energy which is missing from ordinary life. And so that's why you go to the Vatican. That's why you go to Yosemite. That's why you go to the Lake District. And certainly my own experience is one where I go there and I feel something that I don't normally feel. There's a connectedness in that experience, which made it very enjoyable. But that very fact of it, that you're not really participating in the life of that place, or doing more than just observing or consuming that place as almost like a product or a show, or it fundamentally undermines it, and basically turns it into a simulation of itself. It's no longer, as you say, a living working community. It's a show put on for you to have a taster of it, and doesn't have any growth in itself.
Well, I remember as a child, I went to Warwick Castle Warwick Castle in the UK. Warwick Castle is, you might as well be going to medieval times in a certain sense, right? It's preserved as it was at a particular moment in history. There are literal actors there to perform the show, to show you what a medieval knight looks like. And for myself at age, I think I was 8 or 10, that it was a lot of fun to see as a show. And in a sense, because we're very far away from England here in Canada. It was a way to kind of connect to the ancient history of the Anglo-Saxon people. But when I compare that experience to later on that trip, I went to the tattoo at Edinburgh Castle. I happened to be there. Instead of experiencing a dead and frozen tradition, you experience a living and active tradition. And the difference is total. The opportunity to experience a living and active manifestation of the culture to which you're connected is profoundly more significant and transformative than experiencing a kind of museum piece to show a culture as it was 1,000 years ago, and to participate in what I think is a very fundamentally kind of American thing, to go and buy, go and buy a little plastic knight at the castle and, take some pictures and put it on Instagram. These are elements of American culture superimposed with characteristics of 9th century British culture or something.
I certainly think there's something interesting in that, touching on sort of tourism and in effect being an inhibition on actual progress, or that's a word that's often used by the other side, shall we say. So I'd prefer maybe innovation and true innovation on a culture. And I think that there's definitely something to that, and actually to make, part of your heritage living once again, to sort of try and box it into that old manner in which it was done, does inhibit it. Of course, there's a value in preserving how that was originally done, initially done, and showing the original techniques and how it's grown and how it's developed. But yeah, I think there's definitely something in, you're trying to just live it almost as simulacra, right? It's not a true experience of it in sort of the way that the tattoo at Edinburgh is, where you've kept it living. It's just going through the motions of this is how they would have been, sort of using it as entertainment rather than as learning and connecting and having something spiritual there and connecting with your people. And I sort of feel the need to look into Japan's domestic tourism again, because there's something in that, and sort of learning about that, where it's a very strong domestic tourism market, a lot stronger than the sort of international that, the Japanese actually go outside of the country, in part due to sort of their working hours there. But there's sort of something in that in which the domestic tourism market is completely different to how they treat international tourists, because they're trying to get everybody there to experience different parts, different provinces, and what each of them have. Now, of course, there's gimmicks and that, but there's still an element of trying to reconnect them with their old culture there. Certainly, there's more research I need to do in that department. But I think that's perhaps a step that we could look into, of moving this from just an entertainment purpose into something that's actually going to add to people's lives and bring back what was lost.
Well, and in my view, the ideal here is that a people's history lives along with them, right? You can see this done well in the way that many of the classic universities have, all the historical spaces, the historical buildings are part of the active life of the community. You can criticize the universities for many things, and maybe you say it's to do with their cynical marketing self-interest, but nevertheless, their history and culture lives along with them in a way that many preserved historical sites do not. And I think people have a tendency to think about this only in terms of historical buildings, when I think a broader perspective should be taken with respect to landscapes. So we open the stream by looking at historical castles across the UK that the Pendragon Foundation is looking at taking up. But many of these historical castles have a deep connection with the historical patterns of agriculture in the region, right? And in some way, you're not properly preserving the castle without also preserving the townlands around it and preserving the economic activity which operates around it in inside modes which are both traditional but also of real economic utility, because that drive towards economic utility pushes forward the development of that culture in some way.
Absolutely, and I think it's a kind of obvious point, but it's worth kind of stating that when these castles were built, okay, an aesthetic element was obviously a part of it, but it was primarily for functional reasons of being able to defend yourself, to be able to control an area, and to be able to use that control and those systems that you could build within a castle, administrative systems, to administer the farming of land around that area. So it was very much a very functional place, and part of the challenge, I think, and part of why a lot of institutions turn to tourism when it comes to castles in particular, is because a lot of that has shifted to other locations, right? Due to whole upturns in the political order and so on. We don't have feudal lords and whatnot, and new buildings have been built to reflect democratic forms of government and multinational corporations and so on. So we don't have the seats of power in castles anymore. So they're trying to find a new function for them. And I think a kind of easy way, certainly with the popularity of castles in the imagination, and without having to really push the boundaries or be inventive and imaginative, is the tourist model. Is the tourist model. I would add to that as well that it's also in part because a lot of these castles are no longer owned privately. There are many that are still there, but a lot of them are owned by organizations like English Heritage or the National Trust, which in their inception were about protecting and preserving these castles, but as a consequence, they're not very well suited to reacting to the need to reintegrate into daily life or find an innovative approach to making it economically viable. It's not really going to be an organization capable of that.
I also think that organizations like the National Trust are not especially concerned with the living English culture. They're staffed with a huge number of people who are committed to the global urban monoculture, right? And so that set of presuppositions and commitments is reflected in the way that they go about their work. I will say that I was pleasantly surprised, or have been pleasantly surprised regularly in my visits to the UK with how much life remains in the historical parish churches. So they're preserved as historical buildings, but many of them also have living congregations in them. They're a real and active part of the community. The same is true of historical pubs, where many of them have been bought by chains, but nevertheless, they're still a real part of English life in a way that Warwick Castle is not a real part of English life. It's a school child's destination, and I think one of the mistakes that is being made in the preservation, particularly of castles, is this disconnect of the castle from the surrounding townlands. The purpose of the castle itself was as a defensive structure, but the townlands always served an economic purpose. And so in revitalizing the castle, I think recreating the castle as a site for something like a farmer's market or something like that might be a way to honor the castle's history and honor its place in the culture in a way that is not being done by strict historical preservationism.
And certainly that's a challenge that I'm starting to sort of approach and look at, is what can actually feasibly be done with sort of the resources we have, and with sort of a steady progression to make these places a living part of their community again, that also blend and mesh well, right? The last thing you want to do is, if you come into one of these places, is be obnoxious and loud and sort of have your own vision. Rather, it's sort of looking at what's going to be the local needs of the community, what sort of industries they already have in place, maybe where there are gaps, maybe where you can fulfill a function or help expand something out. And so sort of initially looking at that, it's when we start considering sites, what's the industries already in place there, what perhaps are they missing already. Particularly for myself, I'm looking at sort of lower cost industries already, like perhaps the production of mead or cider, particularly in sort of those southern regions of England where you're looking at, there's quite a few orchards, or even sort of local households have apple trees or pear trees or whatever. It's something you can do where you can also get the local community involved. And so they're not just seeing this happen as a commercial activity, but it's also something where they're involved, and they see the castle as part of their community again. And so, long-term visions are I have quite ambitious ones with what I would like to do, but sort of looking at the initial starting up, it's once again that mead, that cider, perhaps even greenhouses where you grow local products. Sort of building on the mead is apiaries, your sort of soaps, your candles, all those little bits which, should hopefully add something, rather than just sort of being a tourist destination that's going to annoy them all by bringing in a bunch of people who are going to take up the local roads and the car parks and the traffic and all that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's all kinds of innovative things that you can do with the real estate associated with a historical building. The last comment I would make is that obviously you don't want to take a historical site and jerk it away from the purpose it served in the community for many, many years. One of the things that is very offensive to me about the transformations that have gone on in Canada over the last 20 or 30 years has been you see it, especially in Ontario, either the destruction of agricultural land to make space for housing, or you see a lot of churches that get repurposed for other religious communities, or get repurposed as condos or something like this. When you take something that was part of a living culture and turn the purpose, instead of turning the purpose 5 or 10 degrees, turning the purpose 90 or 100 or 180 degrees, you've done something which is an affront to the history of the place. And so the art of integrating a historical site into the life of a culture is the art of turning the purpose of a site by 10 or 15 degrees or 5 degrees, rather than destroying it and starting over with, or in a completely new direction, or reorienting it in a completely opposite direction, something that would be offensive to the people who once occupied the location. So I suppose the steps involved are, first, discovery of the original purpose and the intent and its place in the life of that it once occupied in the life of your own culture, and then this kind of delicate task of giving it a life that is in alignment with its historic purpose.
Just to add to that, I think the architecture is a language. Somebody like Ruskin would say it conveys the mindset of the architect and the civilization that architect is from. So the classical and the Gothic, while they share similarities, reveal different impulses within these cultures and civilizations. One example might be the classical is very symmetrical, and so there's an emphasis on perfection. But this emphasis on perfection necessarily and symmetry necessarily precludes more complicated structures. It's often very simple shapes. Whereas the Gothic imagination is one which loves improvisation and embraces imperfection, perhaps a reflection of a belief in the fallenness of man and the impossibility of perfection, and thus allows for a whole menagerie of architecture to form. We can see differences here, and so if you put something in a building of a certain architecture which is fundamentally against the impulses and values from which that architecture expresses, then it's a humiliation of that building fundamentally, and something quite grotesque to witness. So when I see a church turned into a house, I'm often very affronted and quite disturbed by it, because it just feels wrong to see. Regardless of the rational arguments, I have an emotional response to that architecture being treated in that way. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a set of purposes which are compatible with certain architectures, the language of that architecture, and so it's very important to kind of see that and embrace that.
I also think that this is a way in which, broadly speaking, our side has a structural advantage over the liberal modernity, because we're not materialists in quite the same way. We have a vision for what many people in our culture feel but cannot articulate, and you can see this in the way in which people respond. There, you can see this inside all kinds of hobbies, but my favorite way to illustrate this is the way in which, if you go back to like 1990, there were 4 major golf tournaments associated with the PGA Tour. There's the US Open, the British Open, the Masters, and the PGA Championship. And as audiences have been more and more starved for tradition and connectedness, you can see the decline of the PGA Championship and the US Open, which are the innovative tournaments, and the rise in the Masters and the British Open in terms of relative importance, because even though people can't articulate what it is they're seeking, the connectedness, the 400 years of the hundreds of years of history, the ritual of observing it in a specific way, the honor and respect with which the sites are treated, is something people are hungry for and happy to spend money to participate in that kind of living tradition in a way that they're just not in a sort of more utilitarian version of modernity. And so I think if you do this well, there are tremendous opportunities to speak in crass terms, there's tremendous marginal advantage that people who can kind of see this have over those who are blind to it for ideological or reasons of education.
I guess a question that's been circling in my mind throughout this conversation is the means to do this. We've touched on it a little bit, or the kinds of organization or body that's required to oversee a land or a castle or something like that. I raise this in part because take the founding of the National Trust. When Rawnsley and others were defending the Lake District, there was this sense that they started to get that trying to get legislation passed or lobbying individual owners or councils or governments or whatnot was a kind of hopeless task, and actually ownership of these places was necessary to protect them. This was in a period where whole reams of the countryside were being put up for sale. So I think somebody bought the top of Mount Snowdon, another person bought large parts of Avebury Stone Circle, and was trying to dig up the stones and so on. So there was this sense of, no, we need to actually buy these places and put them under a non-governmental organization which is capable of just protecting them. And so that's why they set up the National Trust initially. To my mind, it strikes me that whether it's an organization like that or not, ownership is a key way of protecting these places and being able to cultivate this in a way that, you know, the state at the moment wouldn't be capable of, and we wouldn't trust to do that, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think the men who set up the National Trust were absolutely correct that ownership in an organization with a specific long-term mandate is the correct strategy. I would argue that the correct strategy in this moment is a diversity of organizations, because there's this very effective tradition on the left and among the sort of global monoculture of infiltrating and subverting organizations. And so the larger an organization is, the easier it is to target and to abstract away from its original intended purpose. And so the more diverse, the smaller the scale, the more connected to the local community the organization is, the more well defended it is from getting kind of trampled by modernity. So I would suggest that if you were setting up the National Trust now, what you would actually want to do is set up the National Trusts, plural, and put together like 100 organizations scattered across the United Kingdom, or even across the Anglosphere, with the aim of preserving various aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture throughout the regions in which it's been manifest. This is the view that I took when I encouraged the Beowulf Foundation to participate in setting up Pendragon, because it's not as though the National Trust doesn't exist. It's not as though there aren't other organizations that do this. My view is that plurality and diversity and local connectedness are essential ingredients to the long-term preservation, to the preservation of Anglo-Saxon culture through what is a very difficult moment.
To sort of add on to that as well, it's definitely the plurality. People, particularly motivated people as well. I think the fall in the past has been the fact that there's not been enough to nurture that next group of fellows through. And I think certainly if Pendragon is going to be something long-term, has a bunch of regional branches that sort of communicate every now and then at a conference or whatever it needs to be, because I think that's pivotal as well, having a source of communication. You know, there's got to be a plurality, like you said, but at the end of the day, we do need to come together for sort of national strategies. But sort of returning to that original point, if there's not a cultivation of talent that comes through, if we're not mentoring, if we're not providing guidance, if that continuity isn't sustained, then, you know, that's kind of the point of Pendragon as well, isn't it? The continuity of our culture. And so I think a very important part of this is going to be finding and identifying the talent as well that comes through, sort of directly trying to approach people within our circles that this is a practical angle of rejuvenation and revitalization. Ignore the circus, you know, come back to land, touch grass, right? That's what we always say. But getting people on board, and that has to come through practical results as well. So ownership, yes, but once we've got that ownership, decisive action, and then quickly getting people to buy in and get on board.
Yeah, I think a good way to articulate what we're trying to get at here is that we ought to have a generational perspective on the preservation of our culture. That the job of preservation of culture stretches from the oldest member of society right down to the youngest member of society. That every person in that chain needs to have a place in which to participate in their culture and contribute to it. One of the things that I think is there's this interesting aspect to historical sites where you have everything from the version of a historical site where you can't touch anything and everything's behind glass, and it's this incredible, if you take a family to it, it's this incredibly sterile environment, to the other end of the spectrum where there's no sense of sacredness. And again here, it's critical to be able to articulate between these extremes, understand the context of what you're dealing with, understand what needs to be handled with a sense of the sacred, and what needs to be placed in the hand of the living, right? Like, one of the things, there's a local tradition not too far from where I live, where they have like a pipe band that comes through town every Saturday night all through the summer. But one of my favorite parts about the way they do it is that the whole town then marches behind the pipe band. So they've got, every dad and their kid has their kid on their shoulder and marching behind. It's a way that the tradition becomes participatory, even for those who aren't participating in it in a musical way, right? And I think this is an essential aspect to how the preservation and development of our culture has to work. Every person has to have some way to participate, or every member of our culture has to have some way of participating in it, and feeling a part of it, not just feeling that they've observed it, feeling a part of it.
I think that's really, really key. There's a project that I know of in the northeast of England, which is they're trying to renovate a historic building, and as part of that, there used to be different actually 3 museums in the one site, and you had to pay for each of them because they were owned by different organizations. But now they're working together to make one museum. But part of that process is they're doing a number of engagement kind of programs where local community members don't more than just have a say, actually are involved in developing the museum. So from the selection of objects to the interpretation of them and how they're presented. So there's a real sense in which this isn't just something that an outside organization have decided and is going to be shown to tourists. No, it's actually the community are kind of determining how their story is told, and it becoming a point of connection for that community with their history. So, again, it's not this isn't like a festival or a procession or a march, but even a museum, which we've been kind of critical of the museumification or touristification, that this might be a museum which has more of a place in that community's heart. Which I think, so there is a way to do that potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have been critical of museums, but it's not as though museums shouldn't ever exist. There is a place for them, especially to preserve what I would call every culture has parts of it that are no longer living and yet are a part of it, right? So in Japanese culture, the medieval martial arts are an integral part of historical Japanese culture, and yet they're no longer the practice of the Japanese military on the battlefield, right? And so there is a place for preserving that art form in a way which is not which is artistic or historical rather than functional. And how that's done is kind of complicated. You follow the argument here?
Yep.
Yeah, very, very much so, very much so. And it's again, it's that question of we've been trying to walk this tightrope throughout this discussion of the authentic tradition that's living and is an expression of a people going back into the past, but also in the present and future, covering the family, the community, and a simulated version of that. Whether that's done by actors or actually the people themselves are kind of practicing a tradition that doesn't actually have much connection with them or has died in some way or another. I think I want to kind of turn a little bit the conversation back to what we were talking about before, which is very heavily connected to what we've just been saying about the economic productivity or the need for it to have some integration into life in a real tangible way. And one of the primary ways is in trade, in business, in manufacturing, and so on. And Black Horse, you did a thread on X, kind of touching on Britain's untapped potential as a resource-rich land, and I think that's kind of relevant to what we've been talking about. So I'm going to bring that up, and if you want to speak to it, that would be good if you could kind of expand on what you said there. So let me bring it.
Yeah, I mean, I put this thread together not really with historical preservation in mind.
Mhm.
What I had in mind is the very common argument you see in America, particularly, that argues that Europe and Britain specifically are uniquely resource poor. And that argument has no correspondence with reality at all. The United Kingdom is profoundly resource rich, both in terms of resources as they currently exist and in terms of a historical capacity to make the resources which exist in the United Kingdom valuable. Right? So a great example of this is that the United Kingdom is a uniquely good environment in which to raise sheep. In many times and places in history, now included, sheep farming is not a particularly economically valuable activity. But there was a long period in history where the dominant mode of clothing, wool is a wonderful fabric to wear for clothing. It is a deep part of our tradition, and there's no reason why everyone needs to be wearing cotton grown in Egypt and India and wherever else they're growing cotton these days. You could very well have the United Kingdom full of people who are wearing wool once again. And you could have it at similar economic costs to, like, if you look at the lifetime cost of a nice wool suit versus the lifetime cost of a hoodie, it's surprisingly not that different, because the wool hoodie will wear out quite quickly. Whereas if you take proper care of your wool clothing and you don't expand or contract your body too much by overeating or whatever, you'll find that actually the economics of that piece of clothing over its lifetime are much better than you might think. The point of accessing this is that there's a perception that if the resources that are presently considered economically valuable aren't present where you are, that you must be resource poor. Whereas historically, the attitude has been the resources which exist, which God has gifted this people, are the resources we ought to use, whether other people think they're of any value or not. Now, I do think it's worth going through certain facts of the geology of the United Kingdom here to point out that the United Kingdom is not, in fact, a resource poor nation, even in terms of the resources which are currently considered valuable. The first element of this is that it's generally the prevailing attitude in the among international observers is that Europe has few or no oil and gas reserves. This is not true. The United Kingdom, the North Sea, under the Dutch belts, there are vast reserves of natural gas and oil which could be extracted via fracking. It is a choice not to exploit them. They exist. And so the United Kingdom imports liquefied natural gas from the United States in vast quantities because it chooses not to exploit its own resources, not because they don't exist or are even less economical.
So, I mean, just on that point, in this current Labour government, Ed Miliband, who's the Environment Secretary, cancelled explorations of North Sea oil. There was going to be an exploration of a new oil field, and that was closed down, which then led to the large oil refinery in Scotland going into administration, and somehow he couldn't see this coming. So this is an active political decision that's getting made at the moment.
Yeah, I think the other point, the implicit point that's there, is worth making explicit. Miliband didn't just shut down an active oil field, he shut down exploration. And this is something that has happened over and over in Europe, where even resources which may or may not exist that are being investigated for economic viability, the efforts to investigate the economic viability of resources are shut down, and then the argument is made by the government that those resources don't exist because they haven't been properly explored. There's a whole life cycle to resource development this is a huge part of the Canadian financial industry because there's all kinds of innovative ways to finance resource exploration development. But exploration is the first stage of this life cycle where, sure, there was there are geological surveys of the United Kingdom going back hundreds of years, but technologies for extraction and thinking about mineral refining has come a long way in the last 100 years. And so if you were to look at local resource extraction in the United Kingdom, you'd want to do exploration all over again in some of these regions to look at them, from a different perspective. And I think there's no better example of that. If you scroll down in the thread, I look at the tin mines of Cornwall. Cornwall has been a hub for tin extraction going all the way back to the Bronze Age. So it's not as though the resource is not well known, but for most of the years during which tin extraction has gone on in Cornwall, mining technology has been much less sophisticated than it is today. And it's extremely likely that there are substantial, perhaps vast reserves of tin that exist off the coast of Cornwall, not locked on land. Those resources have been completely inaccessible for the entire history of mining in Cornwall. There are actually indirect undersea mines there where tunnels exist that have gone under the immediate coastlands. But undersea mining is a lot more sophisticated today than it was in the 1940s when those mines were last active. And it is a political decision not to explore alternate techniques for, Cornwall still produces a great deal of tin, but if you were had the attitude of some other governments to try to maximize the value of resource extraction in the region, you could approach it a lot more aggressively than it is currently being approached. Let's put it that way.
I mean, in Roman times, Cornish tin was being exported around the Mediterranean. So you're completely right that it has been a staple of that region for over 2,000 years, and it's a very much political decision not to kind of maximize Britain's resources and portray it as well. It's twofold, isn't it? It's portraying it as not capable of being able to produce resources on a larger scale, but also this turn to try and embrace renewable energies or low carbon emission forms of work, and so this would be the kind of argument opposing this, I suppose.
Well, I also think it's this weird justification for the global system to think that to actually cut off extraction activities in economies that have historically been industrial economies, right? Because you see this in maybe the best way to illustrate this is in the green movement in the United States, where the solution to dealing with the pollution associated with heavy industrial processes in the United States in the 1980s was not to alter the processes, but simply to export them to the third world and then maintain an empire that dominated the third world, right? And now the second, and now the argument for why American troops have to be in the Middle East and in South Korea and in Taiwan and in blah 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 is that the lifestyle that Americans enjoy is predicated on exporting these dirty industrial processes to these other countries. Now, you haven't actually eliminated the pollution. The industrial processes that are occurring are the identical chemical processes that were occurring in Michigan and in the LA Valley 60 years ago. They're just but now you have the double negative effect where not only is the pollution occurring, but also you have this necessity to maintain a global footprint and to be integrated into this global system in order to access the benefits. So it's a very disturbing set of incentives when you start to think about why the economy is organized in this way, especially given that most of the extraction and industrial processes that go on in many of these jurisdictions are actually heavily subsidized. For example, like China is the largest producer of steel in the world, but the Chinese steel industry in straight cost of production terms is not competitive with the natural steel making regions of North America or Europe. They have to ship coal and iron from Indonesia and Australia, respectively, across the ocean, up the river deltas, smelt the steel in a location that has no natural energy, and then ship the steel all around the world. Whereas the reason the steelmaking regions of Europe and North America evolved the way they did is because there's natural transportation networks that drive them. And so their cost of production, because labor is such a small part of cost of production, their non-regulatory cost of production is a lot lower, but they're not subsidized in the same way as Chinese steel is subsidized. This pattern is repeated over and over and over again through either explicit subsidies or the implicit subsidy of not having to follow Western environmental standards.
I mean, yeah, this has long been a bugbear for me personally, and particularly the justifications that are used to sort of try and make sense of this. And the problems I have with it are multifaceted, and you've touched on each of them kind of respectively there. But to sort of put my own words on it, is that a whole idea that we need to get these resources from elsewhere entirely for renewables, that argument in particular has never made sense to me, because exactly like you said, it's just shipping the cost elsewhere, and it exacerbates problems with migration as well. It exacerbates problems with depriving local areas. It exacerbates problems of fuel sort of dependency that we have. I've never understood in the case of sort of the North Sea and the shale why we don't, and it only seems to be for this renewables argument. But even then, as you say, you're just exporting that sort of environmental ecological cost elsewhere, and arguably it's even more detrimental. As you say, we could be far more innovative by this point now with the extraction of this, and likely we could put the funds to better use as well. If we had sort of similar to that Norwegian sovereign fund, I know that's sort of become an internet meme by now, but the idea of the British state having that, of course, a British state that's perhaps a bit better managed, and using that not just for the extraction of further resources, not just to fund other industrial developments, but actually protecting the local environment and funding further innovation in better resources extraction. That argument doesn't seem to be defeated at all for me by the renewables, and yet it seems in part that the renewables is a cost, not only for sort of maintaining what I'm going to call the sort of multinational capitalist order that we currently have in place. Not that I'm anti-capitalist per se, but that's the system that we have, and I think it's rather detrimental, but also because sort of implicit in taking away industry is that it deprives local people of further power, of the industrial power that they get, of having control over these industries, of making and producing. You take that away from these people, you've taken away not only capital, but their ability to influence national politics, and the fact that they have control over resources that the state is largely dependent on. Having a domestic steel production means that you can't mistreat the steel workers. However, if you export that abroad under the pretense of environmentalism, not only can you get rid of those pesky workers and their sort of demands that they make, but also you can pitch it under a lovely clause of environmentalism, all whilst sort of connecting internationally and keeping the order in place by having all those interdependencies. So that's sort of a short little bit on there. But yeah, I've never understood, and it seems entirely just to keep the status quo, that the extraction of these resources isn't done.
I'm trying to. There's something that I remember at the moment, which I think is very relevant, but I can't remember which country it was. There was a country which was a big. I think it was a grain producer, and there was a plan to change its production. I think its food production was a bit more diverse than what I've just intimated, but they, under the guidance of various organizations, global organizations, they try to bank on one food or fruit, and this was an absolute disaster. They were the economy crashed. There was famines and
was
so
this
on.
Sri Lanka?
And I think that's
well,
it.
this is
Yes.
This is a repeated colonial pattern. To re-architect the economy of a colonial possession around a single commodity. Colombia has this history with coffee, where its agriculture was reorganized from a diverse set of fruits towards the coffee bean, and there's layers to the way in which this policy is destructive. First, it places the local economy in perpetual servitude to the empire, because it converts a local economy into an export economy, and a very concentrated export economy, which has a whole set of risks to it. But second, it imperils the global supply of the commodity in question, because it has a tendency to concentrate production in very specific regions. So those who don't follow the international markets may be unfamiliar with the chocolate crisis of 2022, 2023, but something like 70% of global chocolate production is concentrated in Cameroon and one other country in West Africa. And those two countries they're right next door to each other, and they experienced a drought that went on for a couple of years. And the drought resulted in a 400 or 500% increase in the global price of cocoa. Now, the consequence of elevated chocolate prices throughout the world is maybe less serious than if it were some other commodity. But the system that concentrated production there not only doesn't make sense as a strategic element of the local economy, but it also imperils the global system in a way that's not justified by the increases in inefficiency. Chocolate or cocoa is actually native to South America, so presumably it grows well there. There's no reason why such a large fraction of production has to be concentrated in this tiny region of West Africa. There's a similar crisis because of some issue in Madagascar with vanilla beans. And you find this over and over again with niche commodities. Fortunately, in the food industry, substitutability is a huge thing, and so if there's a run on vanilla prices, people find something else. But the global strategy here doesn't have the longue durée in view. It is only focused on what will be the most efficient for the next couple of years, along with what will be the most effective way to vassalize the nation in question. Whereas if you either had the local economy over the next 50 years in your view, or even if you had the imperial economy in view with a long time horizon, you would realize that introducing fragility into the system is not justified by a couple of pennies on the spot price of the commodity.
I feel like what sort of get jeopardized by that long-term view is the sort of ideology that we're currently sort of under, that we sort of talk around here of the sort of global empire here. I think part of the reason why perhaps they can't adapt and can't diversify the regions in which production is done is kind of out of a fear of sort of these independent nations having all their independent production. Perhaps that comes back from sort of the World War II mythology and sort of autarky, that perhaps it is present there. But I think it's more in part in the sort of general trend of materialism and nihilism that we're under, in the fact that things have to be sort of immediately focused and instantaneous and sort of accessed. And we have to live in this material world. And perhaps that's a misdiagnosis on my part, but I think if they made things sort of with a longer sort of outlook in mind, perhaps that breaks their own perception of the way society should be going. And at the moment, sort of breaking the mirage as it is of what progress is supposed to look like.
Well, I do think that they're constitutionally incapable of thinking generationally, because if you extend the time horizon out 50 or 100 years, you're implicitly thinking beyond your own lifetime. Well, if you're a materialist, then thinking beyond your own, a materialist in the way which is particular to progressivism, thinking beyond your own lifetime is a denial of that kind of individualism. Because in order to be a materialist and think generationally, you have to be a geneticist, like you have to be a racialist in some way, and think
you
of
have to be willing
as part of a group to which you have fundamental duties. And there's different flavors of how you might conceptualize those duties, but none of them fit into the remit of liberal individualism, right? There's no way to consider yourself generationally responsible to the group and be a liberal individualist. They're incompatible.
Well, it's also the denial of pleasure, right? And that's sort of entirely what it's focused around, is sort of the constant need for pleasure as well. And like you say, if you look into that generational mindset where you start having to consider the fact that you might have to deny yourself an immediate pleasure, you might have to deny yourself something that you want as of now. And sort of putting yourself into that mindset means you start thinking beyond the self, and like you say, sort of the groups that you belong to, and this historic relevance of them as well. You have to start thinking about who I am and what that means as well, and perhaps if these things matter in the immediate.
I guess tying into that is something that I think is very dear to many of us, is a sense of home, and we've been saying this without saying that word explicitly, but the home is something which is more than just a building in which you live. It's a deep thing which involves not just ourselves but our ancestors and our descendants, the landscape around us, the traditions which make up that place. It's all of those relationships together, and in many ways it doesn't necessarily have to be a grand conception of home either. It can be somewhere like the Shire, for example, or Mole End from The Wind and the Willows, something which is our own but also belongs to others, that we want to pass on to them in a better state. And I think that if you have that vision of the home, you're more inclined to want to protect it because you love it and you want it to thrive and flourish beyond yourself. You want somebody else to inhabit that home in 100 years' time. Whereas if you, like many people today, feel you don't really have a sense of home, whether because of your historical circumstances, many people in my generation in Britain, their families moved away from their traditional communities and have grown up in cities where there isn't much of a sense of connection with each other, with neighbors and community groups. Or you have that kind of, I belong to the world, I'm a global citizen, I kind of reject that sense of I belong to a particular place, I can travel wherever I want. I guess that peak individualism that you guys were mentioning, then there isn't something to invest in the same way. There isn't a home to promote, and in fact it is just then what's in my interest today. So I do see that distinction there as quite an important one for these places, because if you're that kind of global citizen, then why not root all of it, putting aside the kind of economic fragility this introduces? Why not get your resources from all around the world? Because ultimately they're just as much where you belong to as Britain. Now we would contest that on various aspects, like the language, the culture, the clothing, the ways of even thinking that are imbibed by anybody from a certain place. But that's the kind of mindset which allows somebody to say, no, it doesn't matter if I get my energy from, if my nuclear energy is produced in France and my clothes are produced in China, it doesn't matter. It's convenient.
Yeah, I think it's you've correctly identified the fundamental issue. Unfortunately, there's a long distance between identification of the issue and resolution of the issue. So the question is, what can we do now today without having hold of the levers of power, without having hold of the vehicle of the UK government, or frankly the government of any sovereign nation containing the Anglo-Saxon peoples? What can we do from that position to exercise this perspective? And the answer to that is multifaceted. But one of the things that we can do is we can apply the advantages that come from generational thinking, generational and transcendent thinking in various areas, in order to try to pass through this moment. One of the structural advantages that people who think the way that we do have over liberal materialists is that we're able to execute strategies that look beyond ourselves and our own lifetimes. We can take the strategy of outlasting liberal modernity, and we can take the strategy of historical preservationism, and we can take the strategy of investing in the next generation in a way that our competitors cannot. And so we ought to think about the revivification of Anglo culture in context of this broader generational strategy to outcompete our present ruling classes using this advantage of a long view and this advantage of a kind of a perspective which sees that which they cannot see. Right. One of the things that fascinates me is that all around Europe, there are historical buildings in disrepair at prices which, frankly, as a North American, are shockingly low. And so there's an opportunity there to revivify our culture in seeing value that is invisible to those who would invisible to other people.
Well, what I'm going to do is invite the audience, if they have any questions or comments that they would like to throw in. This is a good time to do so. I guess in the meantime, while we kind of wait on that, is there anything that either of you feel we haven't touched on that you would like to mention at this point?
I mean, certainly for me, and embarking on this, and you're sort of talking about the generational attitude and perhaps people feeling a bit lost throughout the generations. I come from that background in the sense I'm almost a traitor to the liberal international order through the life that I've lived. I should, at least theoretically, with the sort of travels that I've been on and the life experience that I've had, be part of that order. And yet, I don't know quite what it was, but sort of brought back into this, and ever since sort of been on a journey of discovery. And I've been trying to find a way to tap back into my roots and my past and sort of connect with that. You know, I'm originally, as I found out, from sort of the Yorkshire region, and yet I'm not in touch with any of the heritage or the customs or the cultures of that place at all. And it sort of speaks to that, again, what I said earlier about the Hiraeth. So part of the reason why I'm involved in Pendragon is not just to give myself that sense of belonging again, but hopefully, you know, my children and their children and so on and so forth, and the generations after that. And so certainly tapping into not just that local experience of being from Lincolnshire, but generally being of Anglo descent, you know, I'm trying to find that again.
You asked me to share this this Spanish castle, Sir Burgundy. Do you want to say a little bit more about why you wanted to raise this?
Oh, just I thought Black Horse might find it mildly amusing. This is probably one of those places that he finds shockingly underpriced. Initially, when I saw it, Black Horse, I thought that Nathan was just presenting me with a wall, and it's a bit odd of what I've put in the chat. That's why, because the first image that was shown was just a very high wall of bricks. It's like, Nathan, this is absolutely wonderful. I don't see quite how this is a castle, and then it of course zooms out. But yeah. Black Horse, if you're in sort of in the market to buy a Spanish villa, why not a castle? Is all I ask.
Yeah, well, one thing at a time. We all have our commitments, but
this one that costs 90,000 euros. I think that was the point, right? That it was
exactly.
Very, very cheap.
It costs 90,000 euros because nobody on Earth has a vision for how this thing could ever be useful again. Right. And this is what I say. One of the things that we can collectively bring to the table is a vision for taking this derelict piece of real estate in Spain I mean, there are whole abandoned villages in central and southern Italy in the highlands that were once thriving agricultural locations. I'm not Italian; it doesn't interest me directly, but part of rediscovering who we are as a people is rediscovering utility in these places where it has been forgotten.
Well, I think that's a great place to bring this conversation to a close. I think we've covered a lot of just so much to do with restoration and conservation and preservation, and there's a clear kind of theme emerging of trying to not only preserve but invigorate a sense of um, home, a sense of a living tradition, and that actually this isn't just a fight against entropic forces which are going to overcome. Actually, taking that approach now in 100 years, however long, is going to reap rewards, and it is actually the strategically stronger position. So I think that's quite a powerful message to the audience, but also for Pendragon, that is very much at the heart of what we're trying to do, and it is core to our philosophy and our approach. I just want to say thank you to both of my guests tonight. I think we've had a great conversation, and I'm very grateful for your time and your insights, gentlemen.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you for all of your work for the Pendragon Foundation. Is it Pendragon Foundation, or what's the moniker?
That's right, the Pendragon Foundation.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on, Mr. Hood. Thank you for inviting me into Pendragon. It's been a wonderful time so far, and I hope it continues to be. Black Horse, I'll continue to watch your Twitter posts with interest, and maybe I should get onto that red ensign thing on Substack as well. That sounds of interest.
Absolutely. And if you would like to volunteer or support the Pendragon Foundation, you can go to pendragon.foundation and you can find all of our information on there. Or you can go to our X account, which is pendragon.org, and keep up to date with all the latest news and what we're up to. In the meantime, thank you again for watching, and we'll see you again in a fortnight or so. Goodbye for now. Bye.